Shadow Hack. Chapter 571, None of my enemies will leave the battlefield alive. The 5 supreme experts of Earth turned into 5 rays of light and rushed toward God Undercurrent, who had a smile plastered across his face. Li Yunmu slightly retreated. He simply didn't want to be drawn into the battle between the 6 terrifying existences. After all, battling with any one of them would have serious consequences for him. Although it was impossible for them to directly kill him, the conflict with them would greatly slow down his recovery speed. God Undercurrent's troops and the Allied army had already begun to fight in close quarters. Previously, the Earth's forces had to endure a bombardment to reach the wall, which made sure that even if they weren't dead, they wouldn't have any flux energy remaining in their body. This was the reason why when the 2 sides clashed previously, God Undercurrent's forces would massacre the fluxers of the Allied army. But this time was different. With a ferocious person like Li Yunmu destroying the defensive weapons, apart from a few unlucky fluxers who were turned into mincemeat because of the explosions, others didn't have even a hair damaged before reaching the wall. After the forces of both sides collided, the ranks of the arrogant God Undercurrent's side were instantly thrown into disarray by the Allied forces. The sound of space being cleaved could be heard, and an arrow nailed a fluxer behind Li Yunmu to the stone rampart. When he glanced back, he saw its tail still quivering. Clearly, the strength poured into the arrow was close to the archer's full strength. Li Yunmu slightly raised his eyebrows and looked back. He happened to see a tall female figure hidden among the crowd, but it immediately disappeared without any trace. The fluxers from Earth both admired and envied Li Yunmu. There were even some who hated him, but after Li Yunmu destroyed the defensive weapons, it was tantamount to saving their lives, so naturally those who were secretly grateful toward him were secretly protecting him. Who? After Li Yunmu exhaled a large mouthful of impure air, the cyan long spear in his hand suddenly distorted and turned into a cyan flux energy longbow. The power of the black-red Thunder Fiend soul-hunting arrow caused anyone's heart to palpitate. It penetrated through the fluxers in its way and struck the 2 leaders who were preparing to counterattack. They had already repelled the Allied forces 3 times. With blind shot in addition to Thunder Fiend soul-hunting arrow's soul-hunting property, the entire impregnable pass and even the surrounding area turned into Li Yunmu's personal hunting ground. Some prey might not die from one arrow, but there definitely wasn't any prey which could avoid his arrows. Some people inwardly sighed at Li Yunmu's terrifying recovery ability. Just a moment ago, a senior fluxer who was almost touching him had been nailed to the stone, and he instantly used the longbow to eliminate a number of enemy leaders holding small checkpoints which were hard to capture for the Allied army. Everyone, this pass can not only suppress our strength, but even that at the level of battle god. After conquering the wall, we don't need to rush toward the guards responsible for defending the wall if not necessary. Our priority is destroying this pass which would liberate our supreme transcending experts. Li Yunmu's calm voice startled God Undercurrent, who was already in a bitter struggle. He hated that he had been unable to remove Li Yunmu from the world. His strength had broken through the battle sage realm long ago, but Barbarian Niu's body was far from reaching deity realm. Because of that, the highest cultivation he could display was peak battle sage. Therefore, regardless of whether suppression of impregnable pass existed or not, God Undercurrent's strength remained at peak battle sage level. He was more formidable compared to battle god, but he couldn't become more powerful than that. If the impregnable pass was destroyed, the suppressing force field he had established with great difficulty would also vanish. At that time, Battle God and the other 4 would recover their peak strength. With his strength only at peak battle sage level, God Undercurrent would be forced to flee unless he wanted to perish in battle. Little bastard! God Undercurrent licked his lips. After forcing Sword Sage to retreated 3 steps with one punch, he coldly commanded, Ling Shuang, stop that youngster Li Yunmu. Everyone else, use your full strength to protect this checkpoint. Before my battle concludes, no one is allowed to retreat even half a step. All the violators will be killed. Ling Shuang, who had a cold expression on her face, lightly waved her hand and commanded in a deep voice, "Barrier troops, attack!" Before she even finished, several hundred Fluxers clad in black armor made of dimensional beast's leather walked forward. They unceasingly moved their blades. Each and every retreating Fluxer died under their combat blades. Under the threat of death and blood, the Fluxers were enraged and rushed toward the Allied forces one after another. They began to resist the offense of Earth's army once more. While tightly holding the longbow in which Little Ching had morphed, Li Yunmu said in a deep voice, "Everyone, Senior Sword Sage's words weren't empty. Either we defeat God Undercurrent today or we return to Earth in a sorry state and wait for the enemy to settle accounts at an opportune moment. Does anyone want to return to Earth empty-handed? I, Li Yunmu, don't want to ever be humiliated in this manner, so today I swear that not one enemy soldier will be able to leave this battlefield as long as I'm standing. They can only retreat once they're dead." The morale of every Fluxer of Earth rose sharply. Originally, the 5 supreme transcending experts couldn't hold their own against God Undercurrent, which had greatly harmed the army's morale, but Li Yunmu's words had caused it to swell up. After battle Sage Vega entered the battle, there was no one who could command and reorganize the Allied army. Those using light weapons were continuously advancing toward the enemy camp, hoping to penetrate even more checkpoints and provide more ground to their comrades fighting on the wall. Those with long-range weapons were glaring at the enemy like a tiger watching its prey, prepared to shoot any time the enemy tried to recapture the wall. The most relaxed people on the battlefield were those using the heavy weapons, since they were simply targeting the checkpoints and bombarding them. At this instant, people didn't care about gratitudes and grudges. Almost everyone's lives were bound to each other, and all of them were at ease with a comrade at their back. After all, this was a battle for the entire human race. Perhaps humanity didn't have good roots and was fond of considering itself as the master of the world. It was also fond of fighting among itself for the smallest of benefits, but every time this race was at the juncture when its life and death would be determined, all of its people abandoned their hatred and joined together against a common enemy. This was the reason why humanity could inhabit the earth for countless eras. Chapter 572, Unyielding Underworld Serpent. After a person's strength increased, their senses would also become more formidable. For example, at that moment Li Yunmu like needles were being stabbed into his body. When the killing intent which was close to materializing came close, his body automatically gave him a warning. Li Yunmu turned his head around in confusion and saw a person holding an épée walking toward him. That person was Ling Shuang. Upon seeing her, Li Yunmu breathed a deep sigh of relief. Fortunately, God Undercurrent hadn't commanded Ling Shuang to storm the Allied army. Otherwise, even if Li Yunmu had been at his peak state, he might not have been able to protect her from the magnificent army. God Undercurrent turned his head and shot a glance at Li Yunmu and Ling Shuang, who were getting closer with each passing moment, and the corners of his mouth curved up. He was an ancient god-level existence which had obtained a great fortune and opportunity when he found the remnants of human cultivation civilization before the Dark Age. It was what had allowed him to achieve his heroic deeds. When he clashed with Li Yunmu last time, it was only on spiritual level. Although he still wasn't sure about the method the youth had used to grasp and expel the divine power from his brain, he was certain that Li Yunmu did not have some great destiny. Moreover, it would definitely not be something which belonged to the Dark Ages. God Undercurrent naturally didn't hope that Ling Shuang could capture Li Yunmu, and he also hadn't delivered her to him out of kindness. He wanted to personally witness whether Li Yunmu could use the same method to free Ling Shuang from the bindings of his secret technique. Tap, tap, tap. Ling Shuang continued walking at a stable pace, coming closer to Li Yunmu. Her steps, which seemed neither fast nor slow, weren't influenced in the slightest by the Allied army. With each one, the might emitting from her body became more tyrannical. The blockade of Fluxers belonging to the Allied forces took the initiative to yield before her despite her taking only a dozen steps. This was the unique secret technique created by Sword Sage. It used the body to nourish the sword, transforming the person into a blade. With each step, Ling Shuang got one step closer to human sword unity. This could only work when the disparity between the strength of the two sides was large, otherwise, the end would timely obstruct it or would become a deceased soul under her sword. Even after Ling Shuang took more than 20 steps, the distance between her and Li Yunmu was still extremely large. Given his understanding of the woman, if she didn't have complete assurance of her success, she would not unleash her secret technique. In other words, there could only be two explanations. First, Ling Shuang was trying to force him to come and break her secret technique. When the two sides clashed, it would be the exact moment when her strength would be at its highest. Second, the distance between Ling Shuang's original location and Li Yunmu's location was the optimum distance required for her to reach her top strength. 27th step. There were still 57 steps between Li Yunmu and Ling Shuang. At this moment, he saw an armor formed of threads of sword energy covering her. Although its defense couldn't compare to his Admiralty cover, its attack power was extremely frightening. Under Li Yunmu's gaze, more than 10 Nirvana Flux Masters gritted their teeth and pounced on Ling Shuang to stop her from getting close to him. But they couldn't even reach her before their bodies were torn to pieces by the terrifying sword armor. A Flux Sage tightly holding his hammer stepped forward to block Ling Shuang's path. While doing so, he roared toward Li Yunmu who was behind him. Li Yunmu, you go first. I will stop this little girl for you. You continue to attack. Regardless of whether you destroy the defensive weapons or kill the enemy, you must change this situation. Although an ordinary Flux Sage wasn't worth more than a fart in Li Yunmu's eyes, such a person still had some position in the allied army. Ling Shuang's sword energy had already reached a terrifying level that made even Li Yunmu feel some apprehensions, so what could be said about an ordinary Flux Sage? Clearly, he was ready to give up his life to give Li Yunmu more time. I truly hadn't expected that one day, Li Yunmu would also be given this sort of treatment. The corner of Li Yunmu's mouth lifted up, and a self-mocking smile appeared on his face. Outside the impregnable pass, Battle God was still closely watching God Undercurrent who was standing atop the wall. Both sides didn't dare act blindly because if they exposed even the smallest flaw, they would be immediately crushed. Whichever side did it, it would have huge repercussions on Earth's future. Hey! Li Yunmu had barely retreated when he suddenly narrowed his eyes and unleashed ghostly evasion, turning his body into a black ray of light that fled into the distance. In a split second, an elegant youth with feminine features slowly rose from the ground where Li Yunmu had been standing a moment ago. I was still discovered? This youngster is really like a rabbit, running around, H.A.H.A., he spat out. The feminine youth was wearing a black and golden gown with broad sleeves which had a small windmill at his waist. He was casually playing with a dagger, which was pitch black like ink, in his right hand. After rushing 200 meters away, Li Yunmu stabilized his body and stopped. He couldn't help crying out in shock. Underworld Serpent? You actually dispatched a battle sage to hunt me down. Seems like your organization has finally decided to kill me. Haha. The feminine youth rolled his eyes and said in bright voice, Ancient God Undercurrent, if you and I can join hands today to kill this traitor Li Yunmu, my Underworld Serpent will guarantee that the entire 7th dimension will belong to you. Unless you take the initiative to leave, no other person will take a share of the pie. The feminine youth was an assassin dispatched by Underworld Serpent. Anyone with cultivation and combat strength in Battle Sage realm was considered a supreme powerhouse, but compared to Earth's 6 supreme transcending experts, he was lacking quite a lot. Therefore, he had been tailing Li Yunmu for such a long time, not daring to attack hastily. When Li Yunmu and Frontline God clashed with each other, he was secretly and got quite a surprise. Although Frontline God was considered among the 6 supreme transcending experts, he wasn't worth mentioning when compared to the other 5. However, when Li Yunmu and Battle God traded blows and came out equal, the feminine youth finally became serious. He was at the edge of the battlefield, yet he couldn't find any way to break their sword techniques even after thinking about all possibilities. With great difficulty, he waited for Li Yunmu, who was already injured, to exhaust all his strength. When he saw his target focus his full attention on the female figure moving closer to him step by step, he took the chance to assassinate him. But he hadn't taken into account Li Yunmu's advanced judgment and thus failed. Once that happened, he didn't continue fighting but instead threw an olive branch toward ancient god Undercurrent. Given god Undercurrent's situation, it was extremely unlikely that he would refuse the assistance of an organization like the Underground Serpent. Chapter 573, God Uncercurrent's Charisma. After hearing the offer, God Undercurrent turned his head and shot a glance at the feminine youth. He then shook his head in disdain. No need. First, he was an ancient god, a terrifying existence which surpassed the deity realm. Second, Li Yunmu was the person whose physical body he desired. Because of that, apart from being destroyed by him in case he couldn't find a way to obtain his body, Li Yunmu would not be allowed to get killed. As long as he had the slightest hope of obtaining Li Yunmu's body, ancient god Undercurrent didn't wish to see Li Yunmu perish in the seventh dimension. This was the reason why he hadn't availed himself to the opportunity of exhausting Li Yunmu till he could kill him in an instant. The feminine youth humphed and cursed gloomily. You don't know how to appreciate kindness. Do you still think that you are at your peak? Without our underworld serpent secretly assisting you, you would have lost the seventh dimension long ago. God Undercurrent pointed a finger at himself as if he hadn't heard the feminine youth's words and asked in a bright voice, You say I don't appreciate your kindness? Moreover, you dare to speak in this tone in front of me in my territory. The feminine youth was left speechless. Although God Undercurrent was weak in his present state, he was still a terrifying existence which put great pressure on the six supreme transcending experts of Earth by himself. If the Allied army had used its troops to attack Underworld Serpent, the organization would have suffered a crushing defeat in one night. The feminine youth hatefully watched God Undercurrent, whose entire face was filled with disdain. Presently, their organization's situation wasn't good, so he who enjoyed a great status normally didn't want to provoke a terrifying enemy without a good cause. The other might actually be able to return the humiliation in the future. After some thought, the feminine youth decided to attack personally. He didn't believe that Li Yunmu would easily pick any battle in the present situation. He was aware that the youth was an arrogant person at his core. If he could have easily resisted the feminine youth's attempt to assassinate him, he wouldn't have escaped. Ching! A sharp and melodious sword cry suddenly echoed. The feminine youth's figure, which had started to fade, materialized once more. His golden black gown began to flail around as he expressionlessly held back the sword in which Ling Shuang had stored the power of her secret technique. He coldly asked, God Undercurrent, even if you don't intend to join hands with my organization, you wouldn't go as far as to obstruct me, would you? Li Yunmu's death has nothing to do with you. The secret technique used by Ling Shuang was extremely terrifying. Even a group of flux sages from Earth wouldn't dare to be confident that they could receive it despite her not having finished all the required steps to unleash its full power. A flux sage who had been through many battles in their life would have to stake their life to stop it. The sword steps alone were extremely tyrannical, because they belonged to a secret technique created by a supreme expert. Yet without unleashing it to the peak and possessing sufficient strength, it was still impossible to threaten a battle sage who had risen by himself. God Undercurrent was standing expressionlessly with his hands clasped behind his back, without any intention to give an explanation. Like Li Yunmu, who had overcome all obstacles to rise above all others and reach his current level, all the experts had arrogance ingrained into their bones. For example, Frontline God who had perished not long ago near Lucky Wind City could be taken. Even if he had many malicious designs in his heart, he was still forced to control his urge to kill Li Yunmu and steal his treasures because of the big picture. God Undercurrent, who was an ancient god-level powerhouse from the olden times, was the same. Even if his strength wasn't at its peak right then, his old arrogance. He had constructed the impregnable pass in reply to the joint attack of the Earth's allied forces. Although it seemed like he had been cooped up in his tortoise shell, not daring to come out. This was the wrong way to look at it. If someone else without a lofty and unyielding character had been in his place, they probably would have renounced everything they built in the seventh dimension and escaped far away to conspire for revenge. From beginning to end, the Allied forces hadn't entered God Undercurrent's eyes. The supreme transcending experts could only attract a little bit of his interest, while the only existence in which he was genuinely interested was Li Yunmu. The pitch-black dagger seemed to have gained intelligence and nimbly danced in the right hand of the feminine youth. He kept attentively watching God Undercurrent while coldly saying, "God Undercurrent, I don't know what's the basis of your confidence, but if you keep getting in my way, you will become the enemy of Underworld Serpent, and we will fight you until our last breath." Hearing the feminine youth's threat, God Undercurrent dismissed it with a smile, not even giving him a reply. "Take a look, you little bastard, you have always acted against me, but how have I been toward you? In order to save your life, I didn't even hesitate to make a terrifying enemy. What do you think now? Do you want to become my subordinate and share endless resources with me?" God Undercurrent's voice was like a thunderbolt on the battlefield, and everyone's complexion instantly turned strange. Li Yunmu had been struggling bitterly so as to allow the Earth's allied forces to break through the impregnable pass to the point that he had almost been completely exhausted. But when God Undercurrent appeared in his vicinity or the feminine youth of unknown origin tried to assassinate him, the supreme experts of the Allied army unexpectedly didn't take any suitable response, as if his matters were completely unrelated to them. At that moment even a fool, let alone the vast army formed of the top powerhouses and elites, could see that Li Yunmu had been abandoned by the supreme transcending experts. They only saw him as a dead weight once he used up all his strength. Li Yunmu was also greatly surprised, because God Undercurrent was someone who wouldn't take the pain without any gain. Why then would he even brave the dangers of abandoning the seventh dimension and offending a strange and ruthless organization like Underworld Serpent just to protect him? If Li Yunmu hadn't been completely clear that God Undercurrent had been planning to obtain his physical body, he probably would have become a faction which wanted to join hands with God Undercurrent before the heavenly transformation. God Undercurrent was a very charismatic person. Apart from the few individuals like Ling Shuang who were being controlled by his secret technique, the majority of life forms in the seventh dimension were delighted to stand there and willingly met their death for him. Chapter 574, Formidable Combat Preparation. Among the 5 supreme transcending experts, the one with the most fiery temperament was the third most powerful person, Sword Sage. When Ling Shuang was targeted by the many powers during the Continental War because she was his disciple, he had personally moved and eliminated the reckless organization in one night. Not a single person had been left alive to talk. He had intended to help Li Yunmu, but he was intercepted by Battle Sage Vega, who was supposed to shield him. In the end, he couldn't do more than required, since among the powerhouses of Earth, Battle Sage Vega was the staunchest backer of Li Yunmu. However, she had renounced him without any hesitation when the choice risked the safety of the whole Earth. When God Undercurrent was trying to provoke Li Yunmu, a large amount of energy exploded forth from Sword Sage, who was itching to rush to the wall and firmly tear the god's mouth to pieces. Li Yunmu, who was standing atop the wall, glanced at Battle Sage Vega with a complicated expression. Sorrow was concealed beneath it. It wasn't that he didn't know that the only person who could face God Undercurrent's lackeys in the battle was him, since he had a powerful physical body and all sorts of life-saving methods at his disposal. It was the reason why he had rushed to the impregnable pass and only sought the Allied army for reinforcement. But Li Yunmu hadn't expected that the person renouncing him would be the one he trusted the most, Battle Sage Vega. Ha ha! Li Yunmu laughed bitterly while shaking his head. The cyan longbow in his hand had already transformed into a thin, cold blade. His previous analysis hadn't been wrong. After all, he was just a nobody with no background. Unless his strength could rise above all the powerhouses, like God Undercurrents who could shake all the supreme transcending experts with his strength alone, he would remain a nobody. Even if he came to possess enough strength to startle the gods and ghosts, he wouldn't be anything more than a chess piece which could be renounced at any time among the supreme transcending experts. Li Yunmyu closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, great killing intent rushed out of him. The next instant, Azure Dragon expert armor, which was already burning with flames, covered Li Yunmu's whole body. He slightly bent his legs, and shot into the sky like a bullet, as if trying to cut through space itself. *TCH who claims to be from Underworld Serpent, do you think you can kill this old man with your strength alone? I do have a personal grudge with Underworld Serpent, but I don't want to trouble others. You, come here and battle with me. Do you dare? The first half of Li Yunmu's words was said in a normal voice, but do you dare were filled with flux energy. Terrifying sound waves filled the sky, even forming countless echoes. A mocking smile flitted across the feminine youth's face. Seems like I have become an undeserving punching bag? Even with so many people here, you directly turn to me. Do you really look down on me to this extent? Before his words were even finished, the feminine youth rushed into the sky, following Li Yunmyu after his provocation. Li Yunmyu was standing in the sky with his both hands tightly gripping the blade which was Little Qing. He narrowed his eyes and made use of the time the feminine youth was rushing into the sky. He unleashed the cultivation method which he hadn't used for a long time, plant essence innate healing reversal. The system had informed Li Yunmyu that underneath the impregnable pass, God Undercurrent had arranged a terrifyingly large spell for refining the souls and energy of the deceased. As the person who had arranged this spell, God Undercurrent used the strength of Fluxers who perished in battle to break through to peak battle sage level. If not for the physical body which restricted him from being able to reach deity realm, there probably wouldn't be any reason for the impregnable pass to even exist. After hearing the system's assessment, Li Yunmyu was inwardly startled. The news explained why God Undercurrent had defended him. The ancient god felt that the victory was already in his hand, so Li Yunmyu's physical body was his spoils of war, therefore others couldn't dip a finger in his pie. The system's next words, however, stunned Li Yunmyu to his feet. It showed up that God Undercurrent had greatly underestimated his spell, so he didn't prepare any cultivation materials to increase his physical strength, and thus the majority of energy in the great spell was left unrefined. Li Yunmyu, given his body's strength, could absorb all of the energy in the spell. Thereupon, Li Yunmyu unleashed plant essence innate healing reversal under the system's guidance and forcefully plundered the energy stored in the 10-directional devil spell. A terrifying energy storm instantly rose up around him. The feminine youth who was rushing upwards paused. Instead of pouncing on Li Yunmyu to kill him, he waited. He found it somewhat hard to believe that the person in the middle of the energy storm was Li Yunmyu, and his mouth went wide open. At that moment, even if someone said that a deity was cultivating in the energy storm near Li Yunmyu, people would find it easier to believe. Despite the two sides maintaining a fixed distance, the feminine youth clearly understood that if he dared to recklessly rush into the energy storm, he would be torn to shreds. The feminine youth gulped down his saliva, and the pitch-black dagger in his right hand moved to pull open a tunnel in space. The thought of killing Li Yunmyu was already tossed out of his mind. At that moment, he only wanted to escape. If he waited until Li Yunmyu absorbed everything within the energy storm, he might be obliterated from existence. Want to run? A mocking voice echoed from the energy storm. The next instant, an enormous disc flew out. Using the void disc, Li Yunmyu quickly closed the tunnel which the feminine youth had opened with great difficulty. No. I'm not going to die here, the feminine youth roared while almost losing all hope. The next instant, he rushed inside the tunnel which was about to close. He managed to cram the majority of his body into it, so when the spatial tunnel was closed, terrifying spatial energy ripped away his right hand and leg. Even if his flesh was at battle sage level, it still couldn't endure the terrifying spatial power. World power was the most formidable type of power which no cultivator could match in their life. Chapter 575, Berserk increase in experience points, ability points, and space elements. When the enemy escaped through the space tunnel with heavy injuries, Li Yunmu didn't have any intention to chase after him. The injuries caused by spatial energy would leave terrifying chaotic energy within the body. Only with numerous high levels medicines and a long period of rest could it be expelled. Otherwise, the injuries wouldn't heal, let alone could one regrow their limbs. Li Yunmu had only managed to plunder 20% of the 10 directional devil spell's energy, but it had still created a terrifying energy vortex around him. If not for his Azure Dragon expert armor and his injuries which were recovering at a terrifying rate, he wouldn't have been able to endure the pull of the frenetic energy. It was unlike the gentle energy of heaven and earth, which anyone could casually absorb. The 10 directional devil spell had absorbed the negative emotions of the Fluxers who had died in battle. They had been passed through several small spell formations and slowly transformed into energy which could be used for cultivation. According to the system's conjunction, the strange spell was definitely not created by God Undercurrent. Given his ability, he probably wouldn't even be able to imagine the real effects of his spell formation, otherwise, he wouldn't have established it for Li Yunmu to absorb all the energy. A hint of pleasant surprise floated onto the face God Undercurrent who was controlling the spell formation on the impregnable pass. With his discerning eyes, he could easily see the transformation occurring in the sky. Once his flesh was no longer able to sustain the berserk energy, he had wondered about what to do with the remaining energy. After all, if he didn't control the 10 directional devil spell, it would instantly shut down. The berserk energy would quickly disperse, wasting his painstaking effort to create it. Since Li Yunmu could absorb the drifting energy, God Undercurrent wouldn't stop him. In any case, the youth's flesh belonged to him, so regardless of how much Li Yunmu absorbed, wasn't it all for him? After thinking about this, God Undercurrent relaxed his control of the 10 directional devil spell and allowed Li Yunmu to plunder the remaining energy. Ding! Host absorbed fiendish energy, experience points plus 10,000. Ding! Host absorbed fiendish energy, ability points plus 10,000. Ding! Host absorbed fiendish energy, space elements plus 10,000. Ding! Host absorbed fiendish energy, comprehension points plus 10,000. Ding! Host has absorbed fiendish energy and formed a fiend origin in his body. The details can be investigated by host according to his wishes. Ding! Because of the formation of fiend origin, Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow underwent numerous transformations. Details can be investigated according to the host's wishes. A series of notifications echoed in Li Yunmu's ears one after another. The numbers on his profile panel also increased frantically. Besides the increase in the resources provided by the system, Li Yunmu was pleasantly surprised to discover that the pull of the berserk energy was refining his flesh as if demanding his physical strength to reach a new height. However, Li Yunmu soon woke up from the ecstasy of the sharp increase in strength, and a hint of lingering fear flashed through his eyes. Fiendish energy, it didn't seem like a good thing. System, the fiendish energy I absorbed this time, would it influence my future cultivation in any way? The system, which was always able to reply quickly and fluently, turned silent upon hearing Li Yunmu's first question after clearing his head. This was because it couldn't inform him that the creator of the 10 directional devil spell was no less accomplished than the creator of the system itself. Therefore, whether for good or evil, it couldn't find out the effects of the fiendish energy. After a while, the system mumbled as if trying to hide something. Host has so much fiendish energy that finding out the exact effects apart from the sharp increase in strength isn't easy. The host can wait to investigate them in the future, whether they are beneficial or harmful. Upon hearing the system's words, Li Yunmu felt a chill in his heart. This was the first time he had seen the seemingly omnipotent system hesitate. But Li Yunmu could still make a rough guess. Although the fiend energy would definitely increase his strength greatly, it was impossible for it to not have any side effects. Battle God, who was standing in the air above the impregnable pass, was watching Li Yunmu's each move. When he saw the feminine youth stake his life to escape through the spatial tunnel, he slowly withdrew his gaze. Even if Underworld Serpent's assassin didn't get lost in the endless void, he would definitely turn into a cripple in the future. This was the best outcome, not considering the chaotic spatial attacks he would have to face while traveling through the void. While watching Li Yunmu, who was wrapped up in the Berserk energy in the sky, Battle God couldn't help but think that even someone as tyrannical as himself would not dare to stay for so long inside the vortex. If the flux energy protecting the body got torn, he wouldn't have any place to escape and would die without even leaving any bones behind. Therefore, Battle God reached the conclusion that if Li Yunmu came out from the Berserk energy vortex alive, he would stand in front of them as an equal and become another unparalleled existence on Earth, or perhaps, he might even become more formidable than them and turn into the guardian of Earth after the heavenly transformation. What a disgrace! It's enough, we attack now. Sword Sage raised his hand, and the long sword, which seemed capable of freezing the space around it, let out a sword cry. Battle God nodded lightly and gave new instructions. If God Undercurrent manages to escape, perhaps we might not be able to capture him in this life. Everyone, attack with full strength and don't give him any opportunity to escape. All of the supreme transcending experts rubbed their fists and wiped their palms. When Battle Sage Vega, who had always remained cool and calm, looked at the figure wrapped up in the Berserk energy vortex, she surprisingly went into a daze. Have I made a mistake? She wondered in her heart. Sacrificing Li Yunmu, who had outstanding combat strength for the future of Earth, which was on the eve of a heavenly transformation, wasn't a bad decision. If God Undercurrent had been forced to make a mistake because of Li Yunmu, their battle would have become much easier. Therefore, although the supreme transcending experts didn't understand her tactics, they didn't jump out to oppose her decision. Battle Sage Vega's only mistake was underestimate Li Yunmu's potential. Chapter 576, Curiosity and Hesitation. Special Energy, Fiend Origin. Rank. Grade. Units, 20,000. Properties, Attach Fiend, Congeal Fiend. Attach Fiend, attaching the fiendish energy stored in the Fiend Origin to the attack. The amplification will depend upon the amount of Fiend energy used. Congeal Fiend, absorbing a large amount of fiendish energy to condense Fiend Origin's attribute. Every day, a certain amount of Fiend energy will be automatically consumed. Side effects: long-time usage of the fiendish energy will have certain influence on the host's nature. Those were the characteristics of the Fiend Origin energy as listed out by the system. Naturally, the thing about which Li Yunmu was the most concerned was the last one. Although the system hadn't given any details, Li Yunmu could guess that the fiendish energy would turn him into an increasingly crueler person whose actions would become more and more unreasonable as time passed. The person would also grow increasingly more cold and detached. In short, if Li Yunmu continued using the power of Fiend Origin or even got excessively dependent on it, he would transform into a monster. At that time, regardless of whether it was Earth or any other dimensional plane, none of them would be able to hold him. Although the system hadn't listed the after effects of using Attach Fiend ability, Li Yunmu, it could infatuate anyone by its ability to cut everything in its path like ants. Given his tyrannical physical body, if he also gained such a domineering offensive power, then which person in the world be able to bar his way? Volw. He released a breath of impure air and decided to renounce the alluring thought, resolving to seal the new power in his body for the time being. He definitely wouldn't use the fiendish energy, unless as a last resort. After containing his thoughts with great difficulty, Li Yunmu opened his mouth after a long time. System, list out the properties of the new Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow. I want to see what sort of transformation had occurred. Battle Skill, Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow. Level, Extraordinary Sage. Potential Evaluation, SSS+. Properties, Soul Hunting, Fiend Invasion. Soul Hunting: once Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow locks on a person, then as long as the person doesn't escape the arrow's range, they will be hunted down until Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow is destroyed or the target is hit. Fiend Invasion: Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow will produce illusions in target's mind and even impair their awareness. The precise effect will be based upon the target's willpower and strength. Since Li Yunmu had comprehended Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow, he had never stopped tempering it. After all, this battle skill could be said to be the most powerful long-range attack technique in his arsenal, but regardless of his efforts, this foundation skill had remained stuck at the integration level. But now, it seemed that the fiend energy in his body had been sufficient to comprehend the skill, but not to advance it to the next realm. Thus, once fiend origin was condensed in Li Yunmu's body, the skill had reached extraordinary sage level in one stroke. Clearly, the blood and flesh energy of the dead cultivators absorbed in the 10-directional devil spell had been purified into the most primal type of energy. Because of it, when Li Yunmu used plant essence innate healing reversal and absorbed it, the system transformed it into all sorts of different energies. The large increase in space elements had greatly shocked him. It has to be known that the space elements were far more difficult to accumulate than the experience and ability points. As for the two skills mentioned by the system, Li Yunmu had already seen their details. Apart from not being able to use fiend origin for the time being, he was completely satisfied with the transformation in Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow. His extreme range with it had been quite terrifying before, but now the arrow would even weaken the enemy's awareness to a certain degree. Those with weak strength would move chaotically in Li Yunmu's range like headless flies, unable to escape their death. The system hadn't mentioned anything about his physical body, but it had naturally received a great amplification as well. Only when compared to the two newly comprehended skills that the boost in his physical strength was not worth mentioning. Given my present physical strength, could I perhaps be able to compete against people like Battle God? Li Yunmu mumbled to himself and looked below to observe the situation on the impregnable pass. Li Yunmu was quite surprised to see that after he had pointed it out, the warriors of the Allied forces had destroyed the impregnable pass, which was originally quite lofty. Although some of the places remained, they couldn't suppress the people at the level of supreme transcending powerhouses. Only the ordinary fluxers of the Allied forces would find their strength suppressed. With the strength of the 5 supreme transcending expert fully unleashed, their true combat prowess wasn't very far from reaching half-step deity. Moreover, they were 5 against 1, so from the beginning of the battle, Battle God's side had completely suppressed God Undercurrent. In the pass, regardless of whether it were the fluxers on Battle God's side or the troops of God Undercurrent, all of them had retreated from the battlefield where the blood of their comrades had been shed. After the impregnable pass was broken, the so-called powerhouses couldn't stay around any longer. When Li Yunmu looked at the fight below him, he saw God Undercurrent, who was being suppressed by the 5 people, suddenly smile in a strange manner. The next instant, his right hand was covered in a layer of black liquid, and God Undercurrent shook it fiercely. Boom! Incomparably terrifying power instantly exploded, and a sandstorm which filled the entire sky suddenly rose up. Even with his present vision, Li Yunmu was surprisingly unable to see through it. He was no longer able to know what was happening underneath. SSSSS. As the sandstorm slowly settled, Li Yunmu couldn't help but inhale cold air. The whole ground underneath was covered by the pitch-black liquid. Battle God's group of 5, which had held the advantage until then, was surprisingly lying on the ground, gasping for breath based on their appearance. The black liquid covering the bodies of the 5 supreme transcending experts seemed to be alive. Even from such a distance, Li Yunmu could sense their vitality being sapped quickly. If the actions of God Undercurrent weren't stopped, Earth's highest powers would probably cease to exist. Li Yunmu was about to take action, but he suddenly recalled the 5 supreme transcending experts watching calmly when God Undercurrent was nearing him, and relaxed. He began to hesitate, unable to reach a decision. There was a good chance that Battle God and the others would still see him as an enemy in the future. Chapter 577, Finally Taking Action. Get lost. Li Yunmu lightly licked his lips, and his tyrannical physical energy suddenly surged forth, shaking away the drops of black liquid almost invisible to naked eye from his body. They quickly scattered in the air. Li Yunmu remained standing in the air with an indifferent expression. It hadn't been hard to notice that his thoughts were the result of God Undercurrent's little trick, similar to when Frontline God had perished. God Undercurrent kept on using such little tricks in plain sight, so Li Yunmu had already become used to them. But he was unable to control the fury in his heart and had no desire to take action. When God Undercurrent was closing in on him, neither of the 5 transcending experts had moved, so now when they were unable to fight back, why should he rescue them? What sort of logic was this? He was ruthless, but in the end, he wasn't completely inflexible. He sighed. The strange smile on God Undercurrent's face didn't change in the slightest. It seemed that Li Yunmu watching with his arms folded was according to his plans. The ink-like black liquid which covered God Undercurrent's right hand truly seemed to come alive. Not only did it crazily swallow the vitality of Earth's 5 supreme transcending experts, it also frantically gobbled up God Undercurrent's flesh. It was even doing at a much faster speed. Within a few breaths, God Undercurrent's whole body was completely covered by the black liquid. When he became a monster with the black liquid covering him from head to feet, he slowly raised his head. It looked like a black water ball has suddenly developed a mouth and a pair of eyes, creating an extremely strange sight. As the controller of the 10-directional devil spell, God Undercurrent could control the pace of Li Yunmu swallowing the spell's energy at any time, but after Li Yunmu had plundered roughly 30% of the fiendish energy, he had already reached saturation. God Undercurrent, who had been waiting for an opportunity, pulled the rest of the fiendish energy into his body without the slightest hesitation. His power reached the peak, and the 5 supreme transcending experts of Earth weren't able to resist in the slightest. They were no match for God Undercurrent, who had recovered his strength. Naturally, using such a terrifying amount of power wasn't without its price. God Undercurrent suffered the backlash of his former power and became something that had a human shape, but was not human, looked like a ghost, but was not a ghost. Before all of the flesh was consumed by backlash, God Undercurrent had to find a new body, or he would disappear from the world. Li Yunmu didn't take action, but this didn't mean that Earth's allied forces also didn't move. Seeing that he was still standing in the air while watching with indifference, the final hope of the top powerhouses to entrust it all to him evaporated. Thereupon, the ordinary flux sages and domain flux sages used all sorts of methods to crazily get close to God Undercurrent. However, these powerhouses which stood above the earth were completely powerless in front of the black liquid and were wrapped up by it in a flash. They were then absorbed until they were nothing more than energy for it. In the end, they were not only unable to rescue the 5 supreme transcending experts, they had even caused the black liquid to grow. Sensing their own weakness, the rest didn't continue to rush forward. Instead, the human powerhouses chose to abandon their honor and knelt down toward Li Yunmu, begging for his help. Li Yunmu felt his breathing stop, somewhat unable to believe the scene in front of his eyes. He would have been an ordinary person if he hadn't found the super shadow hack system. He would have lived his whole life as an ordinary person, or perhaps even been burdened by the investigation of his father and would have been lowered to the lower class. But right then, an ordinary person like him was standing above the clouds, receiving a sincere kowtow from all the top powerhouses of the world. He couldn't help but panic slightly. Before that, even when facing a life and death battle, he had never lost his cool. Vu. Li Yunmu suddenly took a deep sigh, and little Qing morphed into a cyan longbow. As he pulled the bowstring, 7 black-colored arrows appeared. They were formed of fiendish energy alone. The 20,000 points of fiendish energy could barely congeal 7 fiendish energy arrows. Coupling blind shot with Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow, Li Yunmu confidently shot the 7 arrows at God Undercurrent, who was wrapped in black liquid. In his heart, however, he wasn't too certain about his victory, since he had no idea about the damage of his arrows. After all, this was the first time he used them. However, the situation did not allow Li Yunmu to experiment with them. It has to be known that the opponent was an ancient god-level expert who had beaten the 5 supreme transcending experts of Earth without the slightest resistance. Whoosh! 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 The 7 arrows rushed forth with the sound of cleaving through the space. With the addition of blind shot, Li Yunmu didn't need to target. As long as the arrow was shot by him, it would hit the target. The 7 black lights rushed through the air, and the black liquid splashed in the air to obstruct them, but it couldn't even touch the black fiendish energy arrows. They went through it like it wasn't even there. When the 7 fiendish energy arrows penetrated the black liquid, they maintained absolute suppression. God Undercurrent, who had forced the top powerhouses to kneel in front of him, staggered. The black liquid spreading out from his body was reduced greatly and began to return quickly to protect the main body. When it did so, numerous corpses of top powerhouses which hadn't yet been absorbed showed up on the ground. A portion of domain flux sages relying on their extremely formidable strength to resist the black liquid were still alive. There was no flesh on their bodies, let alone any imposing manner. After shooting the 7 arrows, Li Yunmu's eyes had turned bloodshot. This time, he didn't have any intention of saving anybody. He only wanted to unleash a crazy massacre and vent the negative feeling accumulated in his heart. God Undercurrent also didn't have any intention of continuing to absorb the human powerhouses. The corrosion of his energy wasn't something which he could withstand. Li Yunmu's 7 fiendish energy arrows had provoked his ancient god energy, and its corrosive power had become even stronger. If he continued in this manner, he couldn't be certain that he would be able to protect his consciousness. At that time, there would be no speaking about seizing Li Yunmu's body. He would turn into an ancient god-level monster which would only how to kill and swallow. Chapter 578, 3 Choices. Under God Undercurrent's strict control, the black liquid flowed recklessly over the bodies of the 5 supreme transcending experts before slowly converging on the way back to his body. In the time frame of 2 breaths, God Undercurrent transformed into a 10-meter-high black liquid monster. As for the 5 transcending experts who were at their last breath, God Undercurrent wasn't anxious to obliterate them. After all, once he seized Li Yunmu's body, it wouldn't take long for him to recover his full strength. All the sages and quasi-deities of Earth did not hesitate. They rushed to those who were still showing signs of life and, one after another, opened spatial tunnels to return to Earth. The experts of the Allied army didn't ponder over whether Li Yunmu would achieve victory or not. After all, God Undercurrent was tyrannical to the point that he had defeated the 5 supreme transcending experts in a flash. Everyone had to admit that Li Yunmu's previous display was quite conspicuous, but with the present circumstances, Earth's Fluxers didn't believe that he could win. After all, even if Li Yunmu was powerful, he could at most be on the level of supreme transcending experts and no more. If Battle God attacked with full strength, Li Yunmu might not be able to resist him, so what to speak of God Undercurrent who was even more powerful. Li Yunmu's eyes, which seemed to glimmer with a red shadow from the negative emotions in his heart, raised his cyan longbow and pulled on it. Instantly, 9 black-red thunder fiend soul-hunting arrows were congealed. Although Li Yunmu didn't feel anything good toward the Allied army escaping from the battlefield, he also didn't feel disappointed. Even he himself didn't believe that he had a good chance to win, so what could be expected from people who didn't know his strength? After becoming stronger due to absorbing the fiendish energy, Li Yunmu was confident that he could fight any one of the supreme transcending experts, but nothing more than that. Ding! The descent of an irresistible power detected, asking host to escape quickly, the system stated in a cold voice. When God Undercurrent focused his attention on Li Yunmu, the system had begun to analyze the combat strength of both sides. Apart from escaping, do I have any other options? Li Yunmu lightly raised his brows, indicating that if his domineering attitude of advancing courageously was broken here, it would influence his future cultivation. There is, but the price is too great. The system's calm voice caused Li Yunmu's thoughts to jump. He almost began cursing. As the system's intelligence increased, its viciousness had also increased, especially now that Li Yunmu possessed a certain amount of strength. It would only refuel him if they encountered an enemy whom he couldn't rival. One of the choices in front of the host is to sacrifice all experience points and increase the number of shadows from 18 to 23. After this, when God Undercurrent closes upon you, you can unleash unique Shadow Heavenly Blade Chop. This one strike would be enough to make the opponent lose all reason and decrease their strength by 80%. As soon as the system explained the first choice, Li Yunmu threw it away. Although the harvest obtained from absorbing the fiendish energy far surpassed his imagination and allowed him to congeal 5 more shadows, shadows weren't only the means to increase his strength. He could rely upon them to defend his life. If he chose to sacrifice his shadows and had to use ghostly image substitution, wasn't it the same as fleeing? The second choice, host can sacrifice Azure Dragon Expert Armor. The system can substitute for host and obliterate God Undercurrent from existence in one attack. However, if you sacrifice Azure Dragon Expert Armor, it will be gone for all time. The second choice moved Li Yunmu's heart slightly, but he still didn't open his mouth. After all, the strength amplification of Azure Dragon Expert Armor was something which he had to possess. If he sacrificed it, he might escape the calamity, but he would certainly regret it in the future. Isn't there a third choice? He asked quickly. There is. The system gave a positive reply, then continued, but I don't think you have time to hear it out. The instant the system said that, God Undercurrent appeared in front of him. Li Yunmu even had to raise his head because of the other's enormous body. Which one? Option 2 or 1? If Li Yunmu really had only the 2 choices, then he would rather pick the first. Although he would have to sacrifice all his shadows, he could gather enough experience points and congeal them again in the future, couldn't he? System, gather all shadows and unleash unique shadow. Before he could finish speaking, he felt as if something exploded in his head, like an artillery shell had hit it. In a flash, Li Yunmu lost consciousness. Ha ha! Ha ha ha! Seeing Li Yunmu lose consciousness, God Undercurrent opened his mouth, which was submerged in the black liquid, and began to laugh savagely. He couldn't help but celebrate his decision to seize Li Yunmu's body. Although the youth could expel his divine power, he was convinced that it was not without a price. If Li Yunmu could use that method without any limits, Ling Shuang would probably have already broken out of his control. Therefore, he dared to take the risk of allowing Li Yunmu to consume fiendish energy. He had also waited until he had absorbed to saturation, knowing that his flesh would naturally transform again. At that time, God Undercurrent attracted a large amount of power of the spell, which allowed him to instantly reach his peak power and kill the 5 supreme transcending experts in one stroke, completely exterminating any ability of the allied forces to fight him. After Earth's allied army retired or was exterminated, he would seize Li Yunmu's body and allow the backlash from his power to devour Barbarian Niu's body. It has to be said that this was an extremely bold and perfect plan. However, during it, God Undercurrent sustained a lot of horrifying pain and damage. But for God Undercurrent, as long as he could obtain Li Yunmu's body, all the pain and sacrifice in the world would be worth it. Even if he couldn't recover to his peak strength for the time being, who would know that he had seized Li Yunmu's body? Once it was over, he could return to Earth under Li Yunmu's name and say that God Undercurrent was unable to resist the backlash and had died before the battle was finished. With such a story established, he could obtain enormous treasures during the heavenly transformation with the assistance of the powerhouses of Earth. The mere thought of it made God Undercurrent's blood boil. But regardless of how many plans he had made, he never expected that Li Yunmu's great treasure wasn't the least bit inferior to the spell from the cultivation civilization before the Dark Ages that he had received. Chapter 579, System Takes Action. Li Yunmu, who had been standing underneath God Undercurrent, suddenly lowered his head. A cryptic data stream suddenly began to flow through his eyes, and he slowly raised his long thin blade. God Undercurrent was startled. He stared at Li Yunmu, who was lifting his blade, with dread raising in his heart. However, it lasted only for a fleeting moment, because Li Yunmu throwing off his restrictions was actually within his expectations. After all, regardless of how large the price was, Li Yunmu would definitely use the same trick to throw off his restrictions when his body was about to be seized. Li Yunmu's body shook suddenly, and a layer of golden light covered his rosy skin. It was densely packed with golden runes, which resembled an ancient language from the cultivation civilization before the Dark Ages, but God Undercurrent couldn't read them. Admiralty cover was fully unleashed, covering Li Yunmu's whole body. Given his ancient god-level power, God Undercurrent wouldn't be able to injure Li Yunmu unless he found a flaw in Admiralty cover's perfect defense. The thin long blade was slowly lifted above the youth's head, and its tyrannical blade intent engulfed everything beyond it like a tide. Based on God Undercurrent's senses, it wasn't the least bit weaker than the violent storm just a moment ago. Although the blade's onslaught was terrifying, God Undercurrent ignored its crazed attack on the black liquid around his body since it wasn't lethal at his level of strength. Yet he still instinctively retreated a few hundred feet. He was clear in his heart that Li Yunmu's next skill would be his true lethal move. A mere ant dares to seize the body to which I had attached myself. Li Yunmu slowly raised his head. Endless numbers were flowing through his eyes. He tightened his grip on the blade hilt which was raised above his head, and boundless blade intent exploded once more. Its might was several folds more terrifying than before. Even with God Undercurrent's defense, the black liquid covering his body began to fall apart under the invasion of blade intent released by Li Yunmu. Although the damage healed swiftly, God Undercurrent's enormous body was becoming smaller at a visible speed. You are not Li Yunmu! God Undercurrent shouted out in shock. His expression instantly filled with fear. What power is this? Even my divine power was wiped out. Moreover, it is permanently wiped now. What exactly are you? Me? Li Yunmu asked rhetorically. He slightly raised his thin lips and sneered, I am the reason you staked your life to seize Li Yunmu's body, his opportunity. When Li Yunmu was caught up by God Undercurrent's mental restrictions, the shadow hack system didn't act like before. Instead of using up all the accumulated resources to break him free from God Undercurrent's control, it assumed direct control of Li Yunmu's body. After all, even if the system returned the body to Li Yunmu, he definitely wouldn't be able to escape. Ghostly image substitution was powerful, but when faced with an opponent of God Undercurrent's level, even if Li Yunmu sacrificed his shadow to escape into the void, he wouldn't fare any better than Underground Serpent's assassin. God Undercurrent's heart suddenly went cold. He had never expected that the opportunity obtained by Li Yunmu would actually have its own consciousness. Moreover, it could also assume control of the youth's body. God Undercurrent had trouble trying to imagine what level of existence could have left such a thing, but he guessed that it would have lived before the Dark Ages. It had to be one of the legends from before the Dark Ages. Thunder and fiendish energies slowly gathered at the edge of the thin long blade. Without giving God Undercurrent any opportunity to talk nonsense, Li Yunmu struck as lightly as a feather. That was the truth. The strike was as light as a feather. Anyone watching it wouldn't feel the slightest bit threatened by it. Even so, God Undercurrent could clearly feel his death. I don't accept this. I also had a great opportunity, great fortune also smiled upon me, then why? God Undercurrent hadn't finished speaking when he was obliterated by Li Yunmu's strike. Little Qing, who had morphed into the thin long blade, quickly rushed into Li Yunmu's heavenly world, terrified of the system who had taken control of its master's body. After the conclusion of the battle, it didn't want to stay around it for even a moment. After the death of God Undercurrent, the mental restrictions he had placed instantly dispersed. Ling Shuang and the other formidable life forms of the seventh dimension under his control all recovered their consciousness. The group of the most powerful life forms headed by Ling Shuang looked at the figure in the sky one after another with pale complexions. It was true that they had been under the control of God Undercurrent, but they had still possessed their consciousness. They could see but were unable to control themselves and would implement every order of God Undercurrent like an imperial edict. The Allied army had retreated, but they hadn't left the battlefield. Everyone still alive saw clearly how God Undercurrent was obliterated by Li Yunmu in a single strike. Apart from Ling Shuang, all the powerhouses of the seventh dimension shuddered. They weren't clear about Li Yunmu's next action, for instance, how he would deal with them. Flee? In front of a senior who could obliterate an ancient god-level expert in one strike, could they escape? Wouldn't be just fleeing to a faster death? While pondering over the way to deal with those who had seen its strength, the system suddenly looked up. It raised its right hand and cut space. Ignoring the spatial chaos in the void, it escaped right into it. Instantly after, the system made a grab, and when it brought its hand back, it held a parchment. After reading its contents, the system's strange smile froze. It was still thinking of how to squeeze more benefits from Li Yunmu's body. After all, since it had acted personally this time, it would definitely not do it free of charge. If Li Yunmu hadn't been its master, it definitely wouldn't have bothered with such a trifling matter. However, if Li Yunmu perished, the system would fall asleep once more. Who knew how long would it take for it encounter a new master? Humanity might already be destroyed by that time. If that happened, would the cultivation methods recorded in its database still have any meaning? If it couldn't take action when humanity was on the eve of a calamity, would its existence still have any worth? Chapter 580, Most Formidable Great Devouring Technique. When Li Yunmu woke up, he had already returned to Lucky Wind City. There were 2 yellow exclamation marks covering his line of sight. He attempted to mentally click on one of them, and a detailed introduction of a skill popped up. Name, Admiralty Cover, Perfection. Type, Body Refining. Grade, SSS Grade. Properties, Admiralty War, Perfect Defense. Admiralty War, it can take the shape of Admiralty War's dragon inside the body, which can swallow all the dangerous energies entering host's body. When host attacks with his full strength, there is a chance that Admiralty War's dragon will attach itself to it, making it even more difficult to cancel out and defeat host's skill. Perfect Defense, Active Skill. When host uses Perfect Defense, the defense of Admiralty Cover will reach its peak. Any attack equivalent to host's most powerful offense will be unable to cause injuries to host. Every time Perfect Defense is unleashed, it can resist one attack. It can use 3 times per day. Point to note, Perfect Defense has an Achilles heel. If it is attacked, Perfect Defense will be instantly broken, and the attack will also triple in damage. The location of the Achilles heel can be adjusted by host. Every month, host will get 1 free chance to do so. Li Yunmu didn't know what had transpired while he was unconscious, so he thought that because of absorbing a large amount of fiendish energy, some anomalies had arisen in Admiralty Cover as well. When he read about the new property called Perfect Defense, he couldn't help the sight that escaped his lips. After all, the most formidable attack in his arsenal was unique Shadow Heavenly Chop, which boiled down to 1 strike formed from the permanent sacrifice of all his shadows. Even God Undercurrent at his peak strength would be heavily injured by it. Yet Perfect Defense could resist even such a strike? This implied that any existence under Ancient God Realm couldn't kill Li Yunmu in an instant unless it managed to strike his Achilles heel. Its location could also be moved around, and it was said in the marginal notes that he would get a free chance every month. This meant that even before a month passed, Li Yunmu could change its location after paying some price for it. Attacking Li Yunmu's Achilles heel, how difficult would that be? With excitement in his heart, Li Yunmu clicked on the second yellow exclamation mark. Name, Great Devouring Technique. Type, Cultivation Method. Grade. Properties, Devouring all things. Points to note. 1. This cultivation method is one of 3,000 paths of S.H.A.D.O.W. Everything can be devoured and changed into corresponding energy. If the method is cultivated to perfection, even other planes can be devoured and changed to strengthen host's heavenly world. 2. Convert all space elements. 3. I only let it out for you to take a look and don't intend to give it to you right now. Are you angry yet? When Li Yunmu looked at the first point, his heart filled with fiery passion. After all, the most powerful move of deities was to collect their enemies into their heavenly worlds, where they were gods. Yet if Li Yunmu found himself in such a situation, he could unleash great devouring technique and absorb the power of the opponent's heavenly world. With his defense, he could probably resist the attacks of those gods and also swallow their kingdom. In the future, who would dare to stand in front of him? Even if deity-level powerhouses didn't dare to accept Li Yunmu into their kingdoms, he could enter the clans which had a long history and forcefully intrude into their private heavenly worlds to swallow them and strengthen himself. This was such a formidable cultivation method. But when he saw the third point, he couldn't help but wish for the system to take material form so he could give it a ruthless beating. Despite being angry, Li Yunmu still planned to calmly discuss the conditions for the great devouring technique. Now that he had almost reached the peak in all aspects, even a first-rate supreme transcending expert like Battle God might not be able to win against him. With all that accomplished, Li Yunmu hoped to urgently raise the level of his heavenly world. System, he called. However, even after 5 breaths, the system, which had always been available, surprisingly didn't reply to Li Yunmu. He stared into the air, totally confused. All the accomplishments he had were due to the system, apart from the opportunities he had obtained while in life and death situations. Before the system, he had needed to immerse himself in bitter cultivation and slowly accumulate flux energy. If it disappeared now, although Li Yunmu wouldn't lose his current combat strength, it would probably become much more difficult for him to advance by leaps and bounds in the future. Cough. Following a sharp sound of someone clearing their throat, Ling Shuang, who was wearing a white long skirt and holding a bowl filled with pitch-black liquid, appeared in Li Yunmu's vision. What exactly happened? The instant he looked at her, he knitted his brows, and his heart filled with doubts. He didn't feel strange that he was safe and sound. If someone said that even with the system's greatest power his life couldn't be saved, then he would have long ago disappeared from the world. But Ling Shuang's appearance put him at a loss. He had used up all his experience points to congeal the shadows, so it was impossible to remove her from God Undercurrent's control. Moreover, the system would definitely not take Ling Shuang along while escaping out of the kindness of its heart. If Ling Shuang had returned to normal, then either God Undercurrent wasn't anxious to seize his body and instead thought of another trick to make sure Li Yunmu dropped his guard, or God Undercurrent had perished. If asked to believe the former, then even if beaten to death, Li Yunmu wouldn't accept it. After all, as long as God Undercurrent was still alive, Li Yunmu wouldn't relax his vigilance even for a single moment. Moreover, God Undercurrent had received the backlash of his power at that time, so why hadn't he used the opportunity when Li Yunmu had lost consciousness to seize his body? The senior who had taken control of your body said that killing God Undercurrent had caused him to consume a lot of energy, so he will have to hibernate for a period of time. He asked you to live peacefully and not stir up any trouble. Ling Shuang first repeated the system's warnings, then placed the bowl of pitch-black liquid in front of Li Yunmu and said in a deep voice, "That senior asked us to prepare this for you. He urged us repeatedly to make sure you drink it on time since it will be beneficial for you."